Hello and welcome to today's PRMA Consulting webinar on combinations, the third in our spring webinar series. I'm Claire Jones and I'll be joined by my colleagues Anya Dunsch, Stephen Fountain and David Sykes to discuss how combinations of drugs are and will be evaluated by payers. We hope this will be an interactive webinar. So as we talk, please do submit your questions using the Dash panel as illustrated on this slide. At the end of the presentation, we'll try to address the questions. If we run out of time, we'll get back to those individuals after the webinar. Please note that questions will only be visible to the PRMA consulting team. We will also run a couple of polls during the webinar, which you can respond to also using the Dash panel. Looking at the agenda for today, we'll have a brief introduction, then look at case studies in France, which I will talk to. Then Anya will talk about Germany and the GBA, Steve will cover NICE, and David will summarize and highlight key learnings and implications. We've talked in previous webinars about many of the current and emerging trends in market access. Today we consider combination therapy and how all of these trends that are shown on the slide here apply just as much to combinations as they do to monotherapies. But we think that combinations can expect even closer scrutiny from payers and the various other stakeholders when compared to monotherapies. So there are a number of additional considerations which we'll highlight as we talk during the next 30 minutes or so. So of course combining therapies is nothing new. Investigator-led trials have been present for many years using various different scientifically justifiable combinations. But with more drugs coming to market, the number of possible combinations continues to grow. And with new products targeting multiple different pathways as we increase our understanding of the biology behind disease, there's a clear scientific rationale behind these combinations. However, with many of these novel drugs offering substantial benefits as single agents, when two or more are combined, the drug acquisition cost of the combination quickly adds up to figures that payers are not used to dealing with. So here we see a number of different scenarios under which combinations may arise, ranging from the combination of two or more generics being used together to two or more previously unlicensed products winning their first regulatory approval within a combination. But we'll give a special mention to anybody who can come up with an example of that last scenario, because we haven't come up with any to date. But on the next slide, there are some examples of the other scenarios. So as we delve into more detail today, we'll take Faradac and Velcade, Tafinlar and Mekinist, and Perjeta and Herceptin as the case studies that we'll be talking to. So not only most of these combinations very recently launched, there are further combinations of new and novel therapies coming along in the same therapy area, in the same indications, and they raise some interesting issues. We've deliberately picked some examples from multiple myeloma, breast cancer, and melanoma, as these are tumours where we have seen a step change in the management of disease as one or more novel technologies becomes established as the main standard of care. So subsequent therapies then face the predicament of either having to try and displace the current standard of care or alternatively combining with it if there's a clear rationale to do so. So there are many different combinations in development. All kinds of scenarios are being considered, not just doublets but triplets or even quads. And as we look ahead, we can start to see, there's several in development. Last week we had the announcement of a CAR-T and a PD-1 inhibitor in combination, and just yesterday Darzalex and atezolizumab from Roche. So it's increasingly common. So one of the reasons that we're going to look at melanoma is it really does illustrate the pace of innovation which is driving some of the combinations of different therapies. So in the last 5 years, we've seen 8 different products win regulatory approval as monotherapies. With the exception of Cotellic, all products were initially approved as monotherapies, and with the Mekinist and Tafinlar combination being the first approved in melanoma, first combination approved in melanoma in 2014, we saw the FDA approval. There are also active trials involving both Imlygic and Keytruda and several other new agents. So while the melanoma landscape has suddenly got very crowded, it's set to get even more crowded. And that's really what makes it interesting. And apologies to anyone who's been to our other webinars, because we do often use melanoma as a case study, but we think it's really valuable to illustrate that the landscape into which you're going to be launching and trying to anticipate that landscape is really critical. So melanoma has been a steep learning curve for payers, and they will take what they've learned and apply it elsewhere in other tumor types. So going back to Tafinlar and Mekinist and moving on to France, what we saw was the regulatory approval in Europe of Tafinlar in June 2013, followed by the regulatory approval of Mekinist monotherapy in April 2014, and then in September 2015, just a few months ago, the combination of Mekinist and Tafinlar. Looking at the assessments conducted by the Transparency Commission, Tafinlar monotherapy was assessed in May, or the assessment was published in May 2014, and then the assessment of Mekinist and Tafinlar in combination was seen in January 2016, just a couple of months ago. So let's look at the outcomes of the decisions. Tafinlar monotherapy was awarded an SMR of important and an ASMR of 5, which was probably the predictable result, given that there was no difference in median OS in the BREAK3 trial, and in that trial the comparator was dacarbazine. So, but the TC considered the clinically relevant comparator to be vemurafenib. There was an indirect comparison between Tafinlar and vemurafenib provided, but the TC considered, and I quote, "It is not possible to highlight from this single indirect comparison of two studies that there was any difference in the risk-benefit ratio between Tafinlar and Zelboraf, both in terms of benefits or risks. However, this does not signify that the two treatments are equivalent." So hence the ASMR of 5, meaning a price at or more likely below Zelboraf. So even though the reimbursement for Tafinlar was 100%. Looking at the data for Mekinist monotherapy, we probably would have expected a very similar outcome if it had been assessed by the TC. However, Novartis decided not to make that submission. So the next assessment that we see from the TC was the one in January of this year for the combination. And it's a very different picture to the monotherapy story. So there was a head-to-head trial against vemurafenib, a comparator that the Transparency Commission considered relevant, with OS, the payer's gold standard, as a primary endpoint, showing a median gain in survival of 7.6 months. Furthermore, compared with vemurafenib, there was clinically significant improvement in both EOR-TC, QC30 and the EQ5D, and the adverse event profile of the combination was no worse or probably even more favorable than for Zelboraf. So Mekinist goes into pricing negotiations with an ASMR of 3 within the combination instead of an ASMR of 5 as a monotherapy. So based on the opinions of our advisors in France, it appears that in the pricing negotiations for Mekinists, CEPS is likely to look at the pricing of Tafinlar again, even though the target population is probably not very different, because of course Tafinlar monotherapy has the same indication as the Tafinlar Mekinist combination. So in this combination, because both products are from the same manufacturer, Novartis, they will have the option to give ground on one product to potentially maintain a higher price on the other. Roche will be in the same position with Cotellic and Zelboraf, but there are plenty of other combinations where manufacturers are going to have to negotiate between themselves in addition to negotiating with pricing agencies. So I'm now going to pass on to Anya, who's going to talk about what's been happening in Germany.
Thanks, Claire. So if we're now looking at the assessments of Tafinlar and Mekinist in Germany, we see that there are GBA resolutions both for Tafinlar and Mekinist as monotherapies and also in combination, each with the other. So as Claire said before, this is different from the scene that we saw in France or in the UK, where Mekinist was not assessed as a monotherapy. But what is particularly interesting in this case in Germany is the timeline. So the Tafinlar resolution was published in April 2014, which is just under a year after the EMA marketing authorization and, as expected, just 6 months after launch in Germany. But although Mekinist received the marketing authorization by the GBA in April 2014, the drug was launched in Germany only in October 2015, just after receiving its marketing authorization in combination with Tafinlar. So that meant that Mekinist was assessed by the GBA only once. And as expected, the results of this assessment were published just last week, after 6 months after launch. At the same time, we also saw another assessment of Tafinlar, this time in combination with Mekinist. In both assessments of the monotherapies, the GBA did see no additional benefit proven because the submitted evidence was considered to be inappropriate and was not accepted. However, Mekinist in combination with Tafinlar, and as expected, vice versa, Tafinlar in combination with Mekinist, showed an indication of considerable additional benefit. And this is a good example of the right evidence against the right appropriate comparator being submitted in order to tick all the boxes of the GBA. So there is a statistically significant survival gain, a benefit in patient-reported symptoms as demonstrated by the EQ5D visual analog scale, a considerable benefit in health-related quality of life, and also a favorable safety profile. So this timing of sequential versus simultaneous launching might have now implications on the pricing of both drugs. So again, Tafinlar was previously granted additional benefit not proven, and therefore the price is benchmarked against Salboraf, and it's now potentially undergoing pricing renegotiations after the combination assessment. But Mekinist, on the other hand, is now starting from a much better position for the pricing negotiations. Because of this delay in launching in Germany, the drug is undergoing negotiations with an indication of considerable additional benefit. If we're now moving to another example of a drug which is receiving its first marketing approval in combination. So in July 2015, as Claire said before, Faridag was approved in combination with Velcade and dexamethasone for the treatment of adult patients with relapsed and or refractory multiple myeloma who have received at least 2 prior regimens, including Velcade and an immunomodulatory agent. Velcade, on the other hand, had been launched prior to the introduction of the AMNOG legislation in January 2011, so it was not assessed by the GBA. Again, just under a year later after the EMA approval and 6 months after launch in Germany, last week we saw the GBA resolution of Faridag. And interestingly, in this case, there was no assessment of Velcade because the EMA label of Velcade had actually not been changed. Faridag has an orphan drug designation, and as long as the annual sales of this orphan drug are below 50 million euro, the additional benefit is deemed proven with the marketing authorization. The extent of this benefit was deemed to be not quantifiable by the GBA since the submitted evidence did not support the quantification. So if you're thinking at the general processes of assessing combinations by the GBA, there's 3 different pathways. There is the possibility of fixed combinations, which are 2 agents that are combined in 1 tablet, and they have marketing authorization in combination as 1 branded drug. Examples of these are usually HCV or HIV treatments. Another possibility is seen in the middle column here, which are 2 individual drugs that are licensed to be used in combination. And we've mentioned the examples before. There could be Tafinlar, Mekinist, or Faridag and Velcade. These 2 options are undergoing the standard GBA assessment as a whole, if applicable as a monotherapy and combination within one assessment, as was seen for Mekinist. And this is triggered by launching in Germany. The following price negotiations would then be based on the additional benefit that was granted by the GBA. However, there's also a possibility of two individual drugs being combined which are not currently licensed in this combination. And this is possible as long as both agents are licensed in the respective combinations, but not licensed as monotherapies only, and this combination is not contraindicated. And this combination would then not be considered off-label use. These combinations would not be assessed by the GBA, so this provides a route prior to regulatory approval or even in lieu of regulatory approval. Examples of these could be the combination of rituximab with CHOP treatment, but also other combinations are conceivable, such as Imlygic and Yervoy, for example, since both of these drugs are approved in melanoma, but without the specification of monotherapy. The combination of Opdivo and Yervoy would not fall into this category because Opdivo in melanoma is licensed as a monotherapy only. And this again just underlines how important the exact wording of the regulatory label is. This would then result in the reimbursement of the cost of both monotherapies without the need of having further pricing negotiations. This aspect has been subject of a discussion in recent papers which were published by GBA or previous GBA members and heads of German sickness funds, and they suggested a process of how to deal with these combinations. It was proposed that SHI funds or the manufacturers can request the assessment of these non-licensed combination therapies when at least one of these drugs is still patented. The manufacturer then needs to agree to its use in combination to take liability, which is the same as for off-label use. The drug combination is then listed on a positive list if the GBA sees a hint, indication or proof of a clinical benefit which is greater than minor, or at least a therapy-relevant improvement can be expected. After the positive listing, there are negotiations on a combination rebate to be applied on top of the monotherapy prices. The monotherapy prices, they will remain unchanged. The combinations that are not on the positive list can still be used by the clinicians, but these are subject to auditing and the clinicians might have to state specific reasons and justify why they want to use them. And this is an attempt to reduce the use of the combinations which are shown not to be effective, while still not limiting the freedom of the clinicians to choose treatment options. As soon as these combinations would actually become licensed in combination, they would be removed from the positive list and then just undergo the standard GBA assessment. With that, I'm going to hand over to Steve now, who's talking you through the NICE assessments.
Thanks, Anya. So I'm going to take you through a couple of interesting cases of combination drugs that have been assessed by NICE that resulted in very different outcomes, one favourable and one not favourable. So I'm going to start with the not favourable case, so Perjeta in combination with Herceptin in HER2-positive metastatic breast cancer. So Herceptin in combination with paclitaxel was originally approved in 2000 and subsequently assessed by NICE in March 2002. Herceptin, the data submitted for Herceptin was based on a large randomized controlled trial that included a subset of patients receiving Herceptin plus paclitaxel. The modelled overall survival data that was submitted by the manufacturer resulted in an overall survival gain of around 10 months, which the Technology Appraisal Committee considered to be an underestimate. Likewise, the utility rates that were considered and used in the model were thought to be on the low side, potentially undervaluing the quality of life from Herceptin. In the economic model that the manufacturer submitted, the ISA was around £37,500 per QALY gained, which was thought to be an overestimate. And even though that was in excess of the range that is normally used by NICE to consider a drug as being cost effective and therefore recommended, and therefore they went on to recommend Herceptin for use on that basis. If we then fast forward to the combination of Perjeta with Herceptin, which was approved in March 2013 and subsequently assessed by NICE in August 2013, NICE actually found in their draft guidance actually stated in their draft guidance that they would not recommend Perjeta for use in combination with Herceptin. If we look at the submitted data, again, it was based on a large randomized controlled trial of Perjeta or placebo in combination with Herceptin and docetaxel, which showed a significant increase in progression-free survival of around 6.3 months. However, the OS data that was submitted was immature, and there was considerable uncertainty about the relationship between PFS and OS, and the modelled OS provided by the manufacturer was considered to be a significant overestimate. Similarly, the literature, the utility data that was used in the model was based on literature values taken from a previous technology appraisal, which may have undervalued the quality of life benefit for the combination. The economic model submitted by the manufacturer showed that there was a 0% chance of Perjeta being found to be cost-effective in combination with Herceptin at the threshold of £30,000 per QALY gained. NICE then subsequently referred the case to their decision support unit, which in 2014 published a paper on drugs that were deemed not to be cost-effective at zero price. And one of the scenarios that they presented were for combination drugs where the increased time spent in the early disease state results in additional time on an intensive treatment regimen, which is illustrated in this diagram shown, where the addition of drug A to drug B results in an extended time on therapy in the early disease state, whereby the additional cost of using the drug for an extended period may actually outweigh any gain in QALYs from the combination. And therefore, the additional drug would not be considered to be cost effective. And two examples of this were actually given in the paper. One was Perjeta in combination with Herceptin that we've just discussed, and the DSU actually calculated that the annualized cost of remaining in the progression-free state was in excess of £27,000, which is very close to the ceiling for what NICE would consider to be cost effective. So you can imagine that any drug being used in combination with Herceptin would have to have a significant QALY gain to be considered cost effective. A similar scenario was found for Avastin in combination with Folfox. However, this time it was really the administration costs of Folfox alone that was shown to exceed £20,000 per annum, mainly because it's an IV drug that requires a significant amount of time in hospital. And again, drugs used in combination with Folfox, if they extend the progression-free survival period, may struggle to demonstrate cost effectiveness against the NICE threshold. So the second case is Faridac in combination with Velcade for relapsed refractory multiple myeloma. And this was the favourable case, and there's several notable differences with this compared to Perjeta and Herceptin. So if we start with Velcade, which was approved in 2004 and then assessed by NICE in October 2007, again, a large randomized controlled trial was submitted with the appropriate comparator, dexamethasone. However, as opposed to Perjeta and Herceptin and Avastin and Folfox, Velcade is only used for a fixed number of treatment cycles. There was also a clear demonstration of overall survival benefit, so 6.1 months. NICE restricted the treatment to use in first relapse only, in which the ISA was seen to be £38,000 per QALY, which NICE thought actually might be an underestimate. Although still, the committee considered that was still higher than the normal cost effectiveness threshold that would lead them to recommend the drug. So the manufacturer then submitted a patient access scheme where they said they would cover the cost of the drug for patients who didn't respond after 4 cycles of treatment. So it was a performance-based scheme, and at which point the treatment would be discontinued after the 4th cycle. And that brought the ISA down to just over £20,000 per QALY. And therefore Velcade was recommended. If we look at then the combination of Faridac and Velcade, which was approved in August 2015 and then subsequently assessed in January 2016, so this year. NICE actually thought the relevant comparator was Revlimid plus dexamethasone. So the manufacturer submitted a well-conducted, matched, adjusted, indirect treatment comparison to show the clinical benefit versus that comparator. In contrast to what we've seen with Perjeta and Herceptin, the manufacturer actually showed that there was evidence of post-progression survival benefit. Similarly, the submission included trial-based utility data, so the QLQ-C30, which was mapped to EQ5D. And that was important to really demonstrate or accurately predict the quality of life benefit from Faridac and Velcade. Also, the committee allowed the manufacturer not to include any disutilities from adverse events because they thought they would be captured within the utility or the health-related quality of life measure because it was trial-based. Interestingly, the cost of Revlimid and dexamethasone post-progression was actually higher than the Faridac and Velcade combination. And that was to do with assumptions around the sequences of treatments that could be used after either one of those regimens. A PAS, in the economic model that the manufacturer submitted, the PAS for Velcade that I mentioned previously was deemed not to be appropriate to include in the economic model because it's specifically for a performance-based PAS for Velcade in monotherapy in a previous line of treatment. And NICE were looking to restrict the use of Faridac and Velcade in third line, so after 2 prior therapies. However, a patient access scheme for Revlimid was allowed to be used in the economic model, or was included in the economic model. So that may have some important implications for manufacturers that have drugs currently in development which uses Revlimid as a backbone, and that the discounted price of Revlimid may be used in economic modelling. It also may have important implications for Celgene. So I'm now going to hand over to David, who will take us through some of the key learnings and implications from the case studies that we've studied today.
Thanks, Steve, and afternoon and morning to everybody. So the recent case studies that we've just illustrated have highlighted some interesting insights as we think about combinations from an access perspective. So using these as the basis, I will outline some key learnings and implications for manufacturers as they look to develop access strategies for combinations. But prior to that, I think it's worth noting that a sizable number of combinations will struggle or even fail from an access perspective, given the challenging landscape into which they will launch. And so the biological rationale for combining novel agents drives the decision to advance into the clinic, and I think we're all clear that should be the primary decision around that. However, manufacturers should not take it for granted that payers will pay for combinations just because of an elegant biological rationale. There'll be circumstances where the access opportunities for combinations will be greater than others. This may be a function of unmet need, the standard of care into which the combination is thinking of launching, the line of therapy, the OS versus non-OS story, the magnitude of clinical benefit, and the quality of survival. And I'll touch on some of those issues in a bit. So access considerations should be a key part of the assessment as to whether a combination should be developed. So after that evaluation has taken place and a manufacturer has decided to develop a combination, there are some key themes that need to be considered from a market access perspective. And in this slide here, we've highlighted a number of those key concepts, and I'll explore each of these from 12 o'clock clockwise. So the first one relates to the commercial strategy around the combination. So which one do you combine with? Do you combine 2 agents that you own, or do you combine with another manufacturer? And we'll talk about some of the implications of that from a pricing strategy in a bit as well. But it's important, of course, to think about if you do combine with another manufacturer, then there will be a need for commercial agreements with those different manufacturers. But there's a complicated and emerging legal antitrust framework around those agreements that you'll need to understand, and those are developing as we speak at the minute, and those will become even more of a minefield as we move forward. As Anya took us through some of the German examples, it was very clear about the specificity of the language and how important that is in terms of determining the pathway to evaluation and the way and the population in which these combinations are going to be evaluated. So that's absolutely critical in terms of HTA framing. But of course the key challenge we face there as well is that the regulators who are encouraging earlier access to medicines with more limited data packages are becoming increasingly more unpredictable about how they're going to approve products, not just from a yes or no, but in terms of being broader than the trial population or more limited than the trial population. You're never quite sure which way they're going to go. And we've seen examples in CLL where high prognosis populations such as 17p del and TP53 have been included in recent product launch labels, albeit with practically zero data. So this presents a challenge for a manufacturer as they think through that as well. I think what's clear from the examples in the countries we've highlighted are that the process is the same for a combination as it is for the HTA PNR process for a monotherapy. That does not change, but it is driven by label, and hence the criticality of understanding the specificity of the language in the regulatory label. And as we think about different combination scenarios, novel existing, etc., there are potential different implications for the way these combinations are assessed, and also potentially different stakeholders as well. So in the UK, for example, it may be nice, well, it will be nice with a novel, but it may be NHS England if there's an existing product there already. So it's really important to understand that the route may all be pretty much the same, but you will be talking to different people. And the survival benefit, we've got a key value driver around overall survival. It will be the key thing that drives benefit assessment. This is the way a lot of these agencies are set up. It's the primary efficacy endpoint of interest. But as we're thinking about combinations in earlier lines of therapy, it's going to be important to consider issues around what that non-OS story is and how that translates and becomes relevant to payers. And certainly with IOs, where a lot of the benefit is in the tail, and we're expecting combinations to deliver pretty significant survival gains, the concepts of survival benefit and extrapolation are even more critical to support the price points. As we think about the whole efficacy package, quality of survival becomes an even more important part of the assessment. So it's not just the quality of the survival, it's not just the quantity of survival, it's the quality of survival. And what do I mean by that? Well, how does survival work in context of adverse events and PROs? So understanding how you pull those pieces of evidence together that's different from the regulatory perspective and how that meets the payer needs is going to be a critical piece here, because automatically payers will think that combinations have a more aggressive AE profile, and they'll be all over assessing that in terms of being able to try and dilute the value proposition. The costs and cost effectiveness is an important one, and Steve highlighted an example in the UK where a product was not cost effective even at zero price. So that's a big consideration for manufacturers. They think through the cost effectiveness strategy here. And remember, a lot of these monotherapies in the UK have been priced up to the cost effectiveness threshold. So there is very, very little window to operate in there. We've also seen examples where products have combined with products that have significant high administration costs. So that's going to be an important consideration as well. And as we've heard from different countries, which prices to use? Is it the list price? Is it the price in the context of an access scheme? So there's some complexity to unravel there as you start to think through the cost effectiveness piece. The pricing strategy, and there's a number of different components to this, so as you think about your launch price, are you pricing in the context of a monotherapy with a view to follow on with a combination? So what are some of the considerations about that? How do you maintain price if you're moving from mono to combo or adding in additional combo indications? Same kind of frameworks and thoughts that we have today for monotherapy as they move into different indications, but obviously the stakes are higher because the prices are higher here as well. And who has the discounting power? If you own 2 of these drugs, that gives you more flexibility than if you have 1 of these drugs. But just because you do have 1 of these drugs, please don't discount the opportunity to enter into commercial agreements with different manufacturers and come up with solutions that work for the combination. So, and I think that talks to the last point here on this clock, the whole concept of managed entry agreements. So it's really critical to understand the landscape of managed entry agreements that you will be launching into and the incentives and the framings that those present. And I think there's huge opportunity for people to think creatively about managed entry agreements, but this is more complicated than we're typically used to in the context of a monotherapy. So in summary, this webinar is set out to discuss whether we think 1 + 1 = 2. I think we've gone through some precedents where combinations have had positive assessments, and we've seen there is a pathway to access for combinations. We've outlined some thoughts and considerations to think through as you start to build value and understand the commercial opportunities around these combinations. But I think in summary, we think that 1 + 1 actually equals 1.5. So with that, I'm going to open up to questions, and the first one I'm going to take is related to Germany and AMNOG. So Anya, I'm going to ask you this. So the Velcade price was set pre-AMNOG, and in negotiating Faradac, how likely is it that Velcade will be asked to lower its price?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think this is similar to the situation that we've seen for Perjeta and Herceptin. And based on this, I think it is highly unlikely that the Velcade price would be asked to change, because it's not subject of this GBA assessment. So only the Faradac price will now be negotiated, because only Faradac now received a marketing authorization in combination with Velcade. However, this Velcade price might be subject of the pricing negotiations of the Faradac price. But the Velcade price itself would only be looked at again if the GBA assessment was triggered by another EMA approval of Velcade in combination with Faradac. So we have seen the same for Perjeta and Herceptin, where only the Perjeta price was renegotiated after approval of the combination.
So no impact for Velcade.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anya. So Steve, I'm going to ask you this question. How do you think the learnings from other therapy areas such as HCV apply to oncology?
Well, I guess they're slightly different diseases and different situations there. So I guess HCV is a lot potentially for has a greater patient population in terms of its number of patients that it affects. So maybe the prices for some of the HCV treatments aren't as high as we've seen for some of the newer oncology drugs that are coming out, because they don't need to charge as much in terms of the return of investment. On the flip side of that, they're still quite high cost, which presents a particular problem for payers given the slightly larger size of the population. So the evidence requirements will really still be the same, whether it's HCV or oncology. and the scrutiny will still be high because it's a problem for payers. In terms of the treatments themselves, I guess with HCV treatments, they're generally used for a fixed treatment duration. They tend to be curative and may avoid some of the expensive follow-on costs like liver transplants, which could be valued more highly by HTA and the price and reimbursement negotiations agencies, compared to what we have in oncology, where treatments may be non-curative, used until progression in certain cases, or just delay the costs of other treatments in the sequence.
Thanks, Steve. So the next question I'll take. How do you think the way in which combos are/will be assessed in the US varies from Europe? So I think we've seen some very early insights as to how the agencies are evaluating these combinations in the major HTA markets in Europe. It's no different from a process perspective. In terms of US, obviously the landscape seems to be changing there. We'll see the first assessment from ICER as it relates to combinations in oncology very soon, as they're looking at the myeloma drugs. So that's going to be interesting to see what indicators and insights we can get from that. And then it's going to also be interesting to see how these combinations are assessed within the context of value frameworks. And a number of these combinations may well be subject to breakthrough therapy designation from FDA, so launching on much smaller data packages which don't translate well into the value framework. So I think how they will be assessed is a function of the uptake of the value frameworks in the US. So I'm sorry to say there are a number of questions that we've not been able to answer there, so we will get back to people with responses to those questions. Thanks very much for your attendance and also answering the questions in our survey as well. We will follow up with the responses to that survey next week, as well as a link to the webinar. Thank you very much.